agenda. And I know that the NED has been a really important bipartisan institution for decades. But at the same time, we've made a lot of progress, but we're in a challenging moment. And so I thought it was an appropriate time for us to have a collective conversation among the NED and its NED family members. And so I thought this would be I guess I was right since you all showed up. So thank you for showing up. So let me just say a couple of things. You know, for the more than 3 decades, the United States has provided bipartisan support to secure freedom, human rights, and democratic governance for countries around the world through the work of the National Endowment for Democracy, along with 4 core institutes who are represented here. The endowment was a shared vision by President Ronald Reagan and bipartisan members of Congress to invest in advancing democratic values, freedom, and opportunity as a moral and political mandate. I also would add, sort of beyond politics, both sort of the business community as well as the labor movement as well also shared this as well. But unfortunately, folks, I don't think I'm telling you guys anything you don't know, that over the past decade, the work of promoting democracy has been increasingly hard amidst the phenomenon of democratic recession and resurgent authoritarianism, which is increasingly viewed by scholars as a new era of ideological and political contestation. The term of art is a democracy recession. And I think my friend, it's Michael Abramowitz here. He runs the Freedom House, and they have this important metric of freedom in the world, and they've coined that there's this term of a democratic recession, and it's marked by sort of the lack of progress in this area. So, and I would also add that, you know, the bad people have gotten better at being bad, and so there's been a closing of civil society space, and I think hopes for sort of using the internet and new technologies only as democratizing forces haven't necessarily always turned out that way, that it's been a little bit of a double-edged sword. So there's a whole series of challenges here, and so I think we're going to have a chance to unpack the sort of the challenges that we face, but I don't think it's all bleak. I think if you take the long view, there's been an incredible amount of progress, and I think we have to look at the challenges of today in the context of a 30 or 40-year long-term trend. And I've asked my colleagues to talk about what are they optimistic about, because if everyone walks out of here like, oh, this is horrible, this is just, it's all bleak, that's not true. And so I want us to unpack the conversation about what each of you are optimistic about. So I'm generally not this long-winded in introducing these topics, but I thought for this conversation, I thought it was important to do so. So I think I don't have to spend a lot of time introducing the folks here. I'll do so very, very briefly. So Carl Gershman is the long-serving CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, right? So since 1984. So then Shauna Bader-Blau, who runs the Solidarity Center. And then Ken Wallach, who is the president of the National Democratic Institute. And Andrew Wilson, who's the CEO of CIPE. And then my friend Dan Twining, who's the president of the International Republican Institute. So we've got a really, really great group. Okay, so without further ado, so Carl, so can I ask you to start? So can you just remind us a little bit, how did the NED get started? And can you talk about 1 or 2 things you've been most proud of in your time? And then I know everyone knows that things are tough, but at some point in the conversation, you don't have to do this all in a 5-minute intervention. I may come back to this, but what are you optimistic about too? So those are the 3 things I want to get out of this panel.
Great, Dan. And I want to remind you that you gave me 10.
I gave you 10. It's okay. Yes.
All right.
Clear rules of the game.
So they were clear.
Clear rules of the game.
All right. Well, thanks for pulling this together.
Yeah.
And I want to begin by just saying that, you know, I think it's important to put the difficulties of the current period in context. The NED was founded in the 1983-84 period, which was when the 3rd wave of democratization was just beginning to gain momentum. And the NED's first decade was a very hopeful period for democracy, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the greatest expansion of democracy in human history. But it was also a very unusual period. Huntington's book on the 3rd wave was published in '91, and in it he predicted some tough times ahead, and the theory of democratic waves also included the idea of reverse waves. But in the 1990s, which Charles Krauthammer called a vacation from history, many people just assumed that the expansion of democracy was inevitable and would continue forever. Some even felt that because the Cold War was over, the work of aiding democracy was no longer politically sensitive, and that an independent arm's-length institution like the NED was no longer needed. Government agencies like USAID could just do the job, so it was not a very good time for the NED, even though it was okay for democracy. The current period is very different, and we know its core features very well. The 12 consecutive years of democratic decline, according to Freedom House, resurgent authoritarianism, the growing power and assertiveness of dictatorships like China, Russia, and Iran, democratic backsliding in countries like Turkey, Venezuela, the Philippines, Thailand, Poland, and Hungary, and growing illiberal, populist, and nationalist movements and parties in the established democracies. Autocratic regimes have tried to repress independent groups working to promote greater freedom and to cut them off from the kinds of assistance that we provide by expelling our institutes and passing harsh NGO laws that make it illegal to receive foreign assistance. But the work goes on and has actually even been expanding, which is a testament to the determination and courage of the indigenous groups who want to continue to work and receive the needed support despite all of the risks. And it's also an example of NED's commitment to navigate the obstacles and to continue to provide such aid while taking care to protect the safety of our grantees. So there's some good news, which should be emphasized, as you suggested, Dan, so that we don't get too pessimistic. And there's other good news as well. The NED family of institutions remains united, and our work enjoys stronger bipartisan support in the Congress than ever. An example is the 3-hour hearing on NED and democracy that Ken, Dan, and I testified at on June 14th. Members turned out, not 32 members turned out, 32 members turned out, not just to ask questions, but to show their support for our work and our mission. That's unprecedented, and it's not unrelated to the challenges that democracy is facing. And I think the members wanted to make a statement about their support for democracy at a time when US policy is not clear on this issue. In other words, the vacation from history is over, and people think that the work we do is more important than ever.
Yeah, it's true.
NED is an institution that was built to take on tough challenges, and we thrive on that. So the crisis of democracy has actually made us a stronger institution. And nothing illustrates that better, in my view, than the strategic plan we've developed with special funding from the Congress to respond to resurgent authoritarianism. As part of the plan, we now fund programs that address 6 strategic priorities: helping civil society respond to the crackdown, defending the integrity of the information space, countering extremism, reversing the failure of governance in many transitional democracies, countering kleptocracy, that's a pillar of modern authoritarianism, and strengthening international democratic cooperation in meeting the threat to democracy. By pursuing common strategic objectives, the entire NED effort has become much stronger and more integrated, with greater cooperation taking place across the regions and among the 5 institutions represented here that comprise the NED family. I think it's also important to recognize that despite all the difficulties, democracy has made some important gains recently. Among them, the remarkable democratic transition in the Gambia, the fall of the corrupt Zuma government in South Africa, the stunning victory of democracy in Malaysia, and the freeing of opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, the equally stunning triumph in Armenia of the democratic opposition, and the successful local elections in Tunisia that were a decisive step forward in the Arab world's first democracy. Gains have also been made recently in Slovakia and Ethiopia, and the acquittal of Rafael Marques in Angola was a victory for press freedom that reverberated in Africa and beyond. We'll see what happens in Zimbabwe later this month, but the fall of Robert Mugabe was itself another positive development. These changes show that we should never underestimate the desire of ordinary people for freedom and dignity, or the extent of popular anger at corrupt and unresponsive government officials. Nor should we assume that the strong men always win. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a failed system, which is shown by the protests that swept over the country less than 6 months ago and are recurring today. The Bolivarian dictatorship in Venezuela is also a failed system, as is the Ortega regime in Nicaragua, which is using massive violence to suppress a popular uprising and even attacking the church. Other regimes that are not as stable as they appear include dictatorships in Cuba and North Korea, and the stagnant Russian kleptocracy. and the Xi regime in China, also the Xi regime in China that felt so threatened by a peaceful dissident, that Liu Xiaobo, that in effect it killed him, and has had to stoke nationalism to fill the ideological void left by the death of communist ideology. Let me close with a few other quick observations. I think the NED can't take anything for granted and has to constantly find new ways to raise morale and build democratic momentum. Our development of the concept of sharp power, Chris Walker sitting here, is an example of such innovation, as is the creation of the International Coalition for Democratic Renewal, which is a network of leading writers and activists to fight the battle for democracy at the level of ideas and values. In the current environment, we also need to explain how aiding democracy strengthens American security. While it's not our job to try to influence U.S. foreign policy, we nevertheless have to be alert to broader international developments that influence our work and the state of democracy in the world. We don't operate in a geopolitical vacuum. A couple of decades ago, during the famous Vacation from History, Sam Huntington warned that a world without U.S. leadership, and I quote, will be a world with more violence and disorder and less democracy and economic growth than a world where the United States continues to have more influence than any other country in shaping global affairs. And finally, we also need to spread the word about the brave activists around the world who are leading from the front in the global struggle for democracy. I don't know if their example can help revive the spirit and confidence of the established democracies, but we need to do whatever we can to raise their profile and explain that what they do and why our freedom is linked to theirs. Giving them our solidarity is not only consistent with our values, but with our interests as well. They haven't given up, and neither should we. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Carl. Okay. Shauna, thanks for being here. So can you talk a little bit about how the Solidarity Center was founded and some of the work that you've done that you're most proud of, and what are you optimistic about? Because like I said, I don't want everyone leaving this room saying it's all bleak, because there are some challenges, but it's not all bleak. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, and I'm so glad to be on the stage with my colleagues today, so thanks for convening us. So the Solidarity Center is actually grounded in a 100-year tradition of American unions standing in solidarity with workers around the world. And you know, we're a movement. The labor movement is a movement, and movements are bound by vision. And our vision is for political opportunity and fairness and economic opportunity too. And it won't now, hasn't been in the past, and never will be bounded by borders. You know, we have a lot of galvanizing phrases and slogans in the labor movement. The one I like the most that represents our work, I think, today actually comes from the Arab Spring in 2011. The mantra of that movement: bread, freedom, and social justice. You know, trade unions are powerful forces for democracy because we are both economic and political actors. We bring together people around both issues: bread, freedom, and social justice. Unions give voice to the powerless, and that's something I'm really proud of in this movement. We're a microcosm of democracy too. We have elections where there might not otherwise be. We bring people together across ethnic and religious and other boundaries that are endemic in societies. And we're the largest civil society organizations in any one country. And for that reason, we have a lot at stake in the future of democracy. You know, what we know from working in 60 countries around the world as Solidarity Center is that labor rights globally are frequently the most commonly violated set of human rights on earth. 65% of countries bar people from forming unions. 87% of countries have violated the right to strike. The number of countries that have detained or arrested labor activists was 44 last year, and it's 59 already this year. And last year, trade unionists were killed in 9 countries. So our partners around the world are experiencing, you know, the increasingly restrictive moment we're in for civic freedoms very directly. So what do we do? You know, in the labor movement, what we do is we organize and we develop our vision and we push forward. And so when you ask about what we've been kind of proud about over the last 35 years, I was thinking about that, and there's so many things that come to mind, but in light of so much focus on democratic decline and closing space, I'd rather talk about some things going on right now that make us inspired and proud. You know, I think of the 200,000 garment workers who are right now in unions for the first time in Bangladesh, just built over the last 5 years with our support in a country known for closing civic space. I think about the fact that the independent and democratic unions of Africa, we joined together with them this week to witness the founding of a new labor federation in the Gambia, which is a country already mentioned experiencing democratic renewal and revival. And just last month, we joined a trade union global mission to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, both countries where union leaders had been jailed, and their bravery in the face of imprisonment and harassment, and our solidarity got them freed during those visits. But there's something really specific I want to lift up, and I think it's what more we need to be doing in the future in the global movement for democracy, because this is a movement. I think about violence and harassment against women. I think about partners we all have on this stage, political leaders, trade unionists, civic activists, leaders of business, women. When women stand up and express leadership, we are harassed, intimidated, and demeaned. And this suppresses democracy. In fact, it's horrible for democracy. You know, before we had Me Too in the United States, I was thinking about, you know, we kind of have Me Too all over the world. You know, in Bangladesh, where we work, 60% of women in factories experience extreme harassment and violence. In Cambodia, that number's the same based on our experience. And it's everywhere. I mean, in the Nordic countries, 60% of women in the catering industry, according to polls, have experienced sexual harassment. The truth is 35% of women over age 15 all over the world have experienced violence that is either physical or sexual in their homes, their workplaces, or in their communities. This is horrible for democracy, and it's part of the unfinished business, I think, of this democracy movement, to eradicate the suppression of women's voice. Because for anyone who's experienced that kind of violence, you know that it's a suppression of voice. It suppresses freedom of association at work. And so the thing I wanted to really put forward in closing here is that in light of that, in the last 4 or 5 years, in fact, with support through the National Endowment for Democracy and much broader, we have worked with unions in 12 countries across 4 continents to raise awareness about violence against women in this place, in the workplace. And the fruits of those efforts I was so proud to have been a part of last month in Geneva. You know, in Geneva every year we have something called the International Labor Conference, and this is the International Labor Organization, which is part of the UN system. And we get together 200 workers, 200 employers, and 200 governments, and we hash out all kinds of issues. And in this case, the global labor movement, led by its feisty women leaders in the global labor movement, demanded that we discuss a new international standard to create a human right to be free from violence and harassment at work. You know, sexual harassment exists as something you can't do in national laws, and there are international standards on discrimination. But the right to be free from harassment at work has never existed as a human right until now. And that's what we do when we can come together. And so when I think about the future of democracy, and I think about, you know, this room and this stage, I think we really need to be dreaming bigger. You know, there's more we can achieve when we come together across borders, when we as organizations like here on this stage that are people-to-people connections, when we come together in a new grassroots internationalism for hope and a vision of freedom and independence, and we can come together around this vision when we work together and when we think in a forward way, because, you know, in the end, our vision is so much more optimistic and beautiful than those of the autocrats. And in the end, when we're thinking about the future of democracy, we need to make sure that we are all at the table, because really, in the end, in the countries where we work on the ground, this is actually what democracy looks like.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Ken, thanks for being here. And you're one of the folks I most admire in the democracy movement. And we did an exit interview with you because we understand you're going to be leaving in September from the role of the president of NDI, but we hope to make use of you and hope you have an affiliation with CSIS. We want to, you have a lot of contributing still to do, and so I've really admired all that you've done for the democracy movement. So can you talk about NDI, how it got started, and talk about some of the things NDI is most proud of? And you've got to tell me something you're optimistic about, because I think everyone knows it's tough out there, but I need to hear I need some optimism.
Well, my chairman, Madeleine Albright, always talks about our community being optimists, but optimists who worry a lot. And I think that sort of captures our approach to the world. I think NDI and IRI began, this was a vision that came out of the National Endowment for Democracy Act. And it was really patterned after the German party foundations, the Stiftung. And there are 7 Stiftung today that receive substantial amounts of money from the Bundestag each year. But they played such an important role in the 1970s in helping to steer Spain and Portugal into the democratic camp. And it was ironic, because it was the occupying forces in Germany that pushed the Germans very hard to invest in political parties in their country, because of the Weimar Republic and the weaknesses of the party system in Germany. And so there was this recognition, and huge amounts of money have gone into the party foundations in Germany, half of which is spent internally in Germany and half globally. And that was sort of the vision of those who were part of the National Endowment for Democracy movement after President Reagan's speech before Westminster. It's based on a deep-seated belief that if democratic politics fail, the entire democratic system is placed in jeopardy. Oftentimes the international community, if you look at even the community of democracies, if you look at the Open Government Partnership, if you look at the EITI initiative, the view is you have governments and you have civil society. And what is normally left out of the equation or marginalized in the process are intermediary organizations, institutions that represent the people, that aggregate the interests of the citizens. And it's when these institutions fail, political parties, parliament, usually the entire democratic system is going to fail. In Venezuela, for example, there were plenty of civil society organizations. The problem was with the 2 political parties that were seen as out of touch and corrupt. And I always quote President Hugo Chavez, who once said that he was not the cause, he was the result. Yeah. He was the result of failed political institutions in the country. So NDI and IRI began with this notion of believing in democratic politics as part of human development and as part of the democratic architecture of a country. So that was sort of the premise. And so everything I think our institutes do, when we work on elections, when we work with civil society, when we work with parliaments, when we work with women, it's about political engagement, the politics of elections, the politics of parliament, the politics of civil society. This was something that was driven home by a very, I think, revolutionary study done by a very traditional development agency, the UNDP, in 2002, their Human Development Report, in which they talked about democratic politics not only being a means to an end, but also the end. That democratic politics was a means to achieve human development in a country. I'll just make 2 other quick points on the optimism side.
Yeah, please.
And Carl hit on one, and that is we are reminded when we constantly wring our hands and we constantly deal with authoritarian learning, the dark side of social media, the democratic recessions, the failure of new democracies to deliver. We're also reminded on the demand side. Carl mentioned Malaysia, Ethiopia, Armenia, Nicaragua, Slovakia, Guatemala, Burkina Faso, the Gambia. These are all places where citizens are demanding democratic change. Also, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at the liberalizers, the reformers, and the transformers, these are the places that are dealing with their economies in a better way, that are dealing with extremism in different ways. That the Middle East is a little, like Africa, is a mosaic. It is not, doesn't have a capital. And if you look at these places, whether it's Morocco or Jordan, even Algeria, Lebanon, not to speak of Tunisia. These are the places that are handling economic and political challenges better than the countries that are run by autocrats. Finally, and I would say what is different than existed 35 years ago, there is an international architecture on democracy, which we are now part of. We are not the spearhead. We are part of a global movement. 35 years ago, the OAS had a non-intervention clause in its charter, until Carlos Andrés Pérez gave a very famous speech following the failed elections in Panama, in which he said non-intervention is a form of intervention on behalf of non-democratic forces in the country. And then they dropped the non-intervention clause, they passed the Santiago Declaration, the African Union adopted a democratic charter patterned after the OAS, and so you have regional organizations that are engaged in this issue. There were no funds for democracy assistance by the OECD countries 35 years ago. Diplomats on the ground in the United States and other countries did not have democracy and human rights as part of their portfolio. That has changed. You have networks now of election monitors, 4 million now globally, networks of civil society organizations, networks of political parties that didn't exist before that are engaged in this issue. The challenge is, how do you harness all of this? But the lexicon of democracy is part of the way not only states deal with each other right now, but it's a part of non-state actors deal with each other. So given the demand and given the international architecture on this issue, there is I believe, a critical mass that can deal with many of these challenges that are confronting. The question is how to, as I said, to harness these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Andrew, so you're with CIPE. Thank you, thanks, Ken. So Andrew Wilson, you're with CIPE. It's associated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Can you talk a little bit about how was CIPE formed? Talk about some of the things that you've been most proud of in your work over the last 35 plus years, and then what are you optimistic about?
Sure. Actually, it should be my former colleague and mentor John Sullivan up here telling the history of CIPE, because he really was there at the beginning for all this. So I'm doing my best to channel my John Sullivan here in telling an old story. But I think the thing that sticks with us when we talk about CIPE was that CIPE was sort of born in controversy. There was not always consensus that business had a place at the table or a role in democracy promotion, and there was concerted debate about this, and it was actually Lane Kirkland who made the convincing argument, as I'm told, that he said, listen, without business there is no labor, and we need to make sure that business has a role in democracy promotion. But going back to the comment that Ken was making about the German Stiftung model being a basis for democracy promotion, and trying to look at that expanded universe of organizations that were more reflective of American democracy, certainly business and labor were part of the broader dialogue in the United States. And I think it was recognized that business and labor as aggregators of interest had a vital role to play within that. The second argument that was, I think, going out a lot was that if you established private ownership, you established a market, that democracy would follow. I think there's been a lot of debate on that since, and I think we can debate whether something's a market or just a phenomenon of private ownership in an economy. But it's certainly, I think, now we look back on 35 years of studying this sort of thing, there certainly is a symbiosis between markets and democracy that are mutually reinforcing. And when you've got a private sector that's based on values of transparency and accountability and fairness and responsibility, you're also reflecting a society that's based on those principles. And those are certainly our principles of democracy. And also, NDI and CIPE can argue over a trademark here about the phrase democracy that delivers, but certainly if we don't pay attention to the way that that democracies do provide for a better well-being for people, they do lose legitimacy, and we do need to focus, I think, on the role that small business in particular can play in creating jobs and creating opportunity and being a stabilizing factor in society, and being something that demands good governance, needs good governance in order to thrive. So a lot of CIPE's early work was really focused on this idea that we need good governance. It's not just about elections, but we have to get the secret sauce of a market correct, and that secret sauce includes property rights, it includes the rule of law, it includes free and fair competition and freedom from corruption, all those kinds of things that we sort of take for granted, frankly we took for granted in the 90s when we were looking at Eastern Europe in transition, and boy did that come back to haunt us when we watched, when we didn't pay attention to those values and those issues, and we watched a retrenchment occur in places like Russia further on. I think too, at the time we were formed, we had a pretty good board of directors. Now, it's not to say we don't have a great board now, but we had a thoughtful board that sat down and said, well, if we're going to approach this new task of trying to merge markets and democracy as a line of thought, how do we go about doing that? And I think, in principle, it was that we weren't given a very large budget and we were given a global mandate, so there was a little bit of thriftiness that went into the business model. But essentially, these are business people that said, look, when you go into a new market, you don't build a greenfield investment site right away. You find local partners. You find people who understand how the local market works, how business works, how governance works. They know best how to find those solutions. So much like the NED itself, CIPE had a focus that really was driven through partnership with local groups. But at the same time, realizing that old saw about thinking globally and acting locally, that there was an importance of international norms and standards that just were basic to functioning markets that needed to be reinforced and identified. So we needed to make sure that we were engaging with global groups, and then we were taking that information and translating it down to what does this mean at the local level? How can you make this nuts and bolts approach to making these things work at the local level? And that local partnership role where we're strengthening our fellow organizations, our fellow chambers of commerce and associations and think tanks, our partners around the world who share our values. How do we help them make those arguments and find the content for that argument? And also, how do we teach people to ask the question, why do things work the way they do? And that's key to finding solutions, is recognizing that every country has a unique situation. Every country has to have a unique solution to the problem that they're facing with. And enabling people and teaching people to start asking the questions, why do behaviors happen a certain way? And then look to answers and how can you change behaviors is very important. And then finally, that reform is incremental. And I think, again, that was that assumption we made in places like Russia early on, that somehow you just did a big sweep once and everything would follow. And we've learned over the years that these things are little steps all along the way, and the building democracy is a lot of little steps. Because what we're doing is we're changing the way people think about things and changing the way they act, and then changing the institutions to fit that. And you can't do that all at once. It has to be incremental. So when you ask me about, well, what are we proud of? You know, there's a whole range of activities that we've done, and because of the incremental nature of this, it's very hard to say one thing over another. But I'll mention again, Bangladesh comes up as a country that's great to focus on. The Bangladesh Women's Chamber of Commerce, which was looking about how do women get access, what is their biggest problem? They couldn't get access to credit because they couldn't collateralize their loans. And rather than try to start new microloan programs, what our partners at the Bangladesh Women's Chamber understood was that the problems, when they asked the question why, was within the banks. And it was the fact that the banks didn't want to lend because of their own regulations that were set up by the government. So they realized they had to go to the central bank and talk to the central bank about fixing some regulations that affected how banks lend. And then when the banks still weren't lending, they went back to the banks and said, you need to have loan officers that's only job is to service women clients. And then when they did that, they started getting on the boards of banks. And now we're looking at a small program that was a net investment that now has generated loans for 10,000 women. That's the sort of change we talk about when we talk about changing, but it was one step at a time. And at that global level, one of my favorite stories is this is how basic some of this gets. It's creating words. When we were doing corporate governance work in the Middle East, we were told, you realize this whole room doesn't know what you're talking about because there was no word for corporate governance in Arabic. We had to work with our colleagues in Egypt to actually create the word so we could have the debate. So it's little questions about getting a loan to huge issues about what are the words we choose to use. And that's been the wonderful thing about working at CIPE. What makes me optimistic? Well, I've been at CIPE for 22 years, and I can tell you that what makes me most optimistic is seeing the change that's happened within the private sector itself. Seeing the change at both multinationals and at the local level in the way companies view their role in society and within the globe. Part of that has been external pressure from civil society for things like caring about the environment or labor or human rights. But a lot of that has been driven by business decisions, and what we're seeing now is that the business case for democracy, for companies, for decision makers in companies, is becoming clear. And it's not just at the multinationals who are moving from models of CSR, corporate social responsibility, to models of corporate citizenship and engagement. It's at the local level. We're having discussions now with companies, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, who realize that A, the promise of globalization is within reach, that they can access markets, but B, if they want to do that, they have to be good citizens. And this concept of corporate citizenship translating now down into the local business community makes me optimistic at the heart, because companies are starting to figure out that there's money to be made from being good citizens.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Dan, thanks for being here. So you're the president of the International Republican Institute. So talk about, how did IRI get started? What are you all most proud about, and what are you optimistic about?
Okay, so Ken began the origin story. I mean, if I could just broaden it out a bit along with Carl. Ronald Reagan gave this speech in Westminster in the British Parliament in 1982, and he said, look, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not going to do the whole speech. The way we're going to win the Cold War, it's actually not going to be won through a test of guns and bombs. It's going to be won through a contest of wills and ideas, right? And the Reagan vision was that our system of open government, of democratic accountability and responsiveness, was a superior model to the totalitarian one, and that the best way to compete with the Soviet Empire was to make a bet on the premise that people everywhere wanted to be free, including people in the Soviet Empire, just as much as people in the United States or Great Britain, right? Now, I sometimes worry that we get very nostalgic about our work. I'm happy to talk about various successes in the past, but I actually think we should really do a lot to situate this work today. We're 35 years in the context of the world that we live in today. And I would just like to outline 4 quick ways in which the work that we are all engaged in is taking on some of these strategic challenges to the kind of democratic open world order that has made America so safe and secure and prosperous for all these years. One is the impact of our work on countering violent extremism, right? Our work tries to build oases of governance, responsive, accountable, two-way politics, in some pretty tough places in the world, not just in the Middle East, but in parts of Southeast Asia, parts of South Asia, parts of Europe, the Balkans, where there is a risk of growing radicalization and disaffection, in part largely because of governance breakdowns, right? So our military friends, Secretary Mattis came to the IRI Freedom Dinner, Secretary of Defense, and he said, look, you know, where you all succeed in this work, we don't need to fight. Right? Where you all succeed using these peacetime tools, my Marines don't need to deploy. This is a long game, and we have a lot more work to do there, but that's one. 2 is the challenge of uncontrolled mass migration, right? Which has transformed European politics, right? The authoritarian resurgence in Eastern Europe, Brexit, the crack up of some of the founding unity of the European institutions, is partly a result of the conflicts in the Middle East and the fact they've produced millions of refugees knocking on the doors of Europe. Similarly, in our own hemisphere, the non-interventionists used to say, what happens in a country, that's about that country, it's not about anyone else. Look at Venezuela. It's produced as many refugees as the Syrian conflict. There are as many refugees streaming out of Venezuela as there are streaming out of this deadly, atrocious war characterized by barrel bombs and other things in Syria. Dislocating the region. Look at the problems of gangsterism and just acute violence in Central American societies, right? And the fact that that is leading desperate civilians, a lot of women and children, a lot of honest young men to flee Central American societies and head north to the US border. So the kind of work that we are doing is very focused on helping to build citizen security by getting a grip on violence, by reforming police forces, by reforming local government institutions so they can deliver for citizens, to get a grip on kind of the failing state violence emanating out of these countries that is producing these desperate refugees coming to our shores. That's 2. 3 is Russian disinformation and kind of these hybrid forms of war other than military kinetic action. You know, the founding fathers of the United States were actually quite obsessed with the risks to the American democratic experiment posed by authoritarian influence and intervention in the United States. If you go back and read some of their writings, they were quite consumed with the risks that would be posed to this tiny little American republic in a world of European tyrannies, right? And that was a core threat to the American democratic experiment, right? We're now rich and powerful, but the threat has not gone away. And these digital tools in particular make it possible for countries like Russia to use state instruments to attack the pillars of our democracy. We are doing a lot of work around disinformation, both IRI and NDI, in Europe, in the West writ large. We don't have a mandate to operate in the United States, but in the West writ large, to spotlight it. Lots of citizens in Europe are subject to Russian disinformation through the media, through social media, and they don't know it's disinformation. So highlighting the fact that this is a foreign influence operation and then creating political party and other alliances to combat it is central to our work on that front. And 4th, the very different challenge posed by the rise of a Chinese authoritarian superpower, right? The Chinese model looks attractive. It has produced wealth, it has produced a form of stability. It's particularly attractive if you're a strong man in another country that would love to import the suite of Chinese digital surveillance technologies to better control your own publics, and you'd like to benefit from some Chinese infrastructure investments and maybe a bit of money on the side for you and your family. So it's an attractive model, at least for some. We travel a lot. Everywhere I go, in Asia, elsewhere touched by Chinese influence, in the Middle East and Africa and Europe, nobody wants to be part of another country's sphere of influence, right? Every country wants to make its own choices and to exercise sovereign autonomous politics without the tail of foreign influence wagging the dog of domestic politics at home. And so we have a line of work focused on helping civil society and political party groups shine a spotlight on foreign influence in their countries, right? So that citizens have all the facts about who is meddling and are free to make their own choices and can understand some of the corrupt infrastructure deals, for instance, that have hijacked politics in countries like Cambodia and Sri Lanka. So those are 4 areas. Let me just conclude with the final thought, which is that I actually accept the Trump administration's premise that this is a very competitive world, that the world is a competitive arena. Right? We don't just have a happy liberal international order out there that somehow will sustain itself. The world is a competitive arena. Our competitors are playing offense, right? And they are not using military tools. There are some exceptions, like the Russian invasion of Crimea. But by and large, they are not using military tools. They are using non-military, non-kinetic forms of influence. The good news for the United States is that most people in the world want to be free to have a choice and a voice. And most people in the world would welcome more democratic choice and accountability. And if we want to preserve a world that is free and safe for the United States, helping other countries to uphold open politics, transparent, accountable politics is a strategic win for the United States. Thank you.
Amen. Good. Okay. So I want to ask each of you to either respond to one of the other questions I'm going to put to you. Don't respond to both. But one is, there's a criticism out there, I think, on the libertarian right and maybe on the progressive left, that what's the difference between this stuff and what the Russians are doing? Is sort of a critique out there. And so I'd like to hear what each of you all think about that. And or if you could just, I'm going to use the word China, and I want you to word associate with the word China, and how does that intersect with your work? So either one of those, pick one, door number 1 or door number 2. Carl?
All right. I mean, I think the answer to the first is obvious, so I won't transparency. I won't answer it. But on China, one of the priorities we have is democratic unity, and I think there's been an awakening in the United States about China, and it's really over the last few months. It was in the March cover of The Economist, which said that there's a realization now that the West's 25-year bet on China has failed. Because the bet was that if China grew economically, it would liberalize. But that hasn't happened, and the economic growth has both confirmed in their minds the state-driven economic model and also given them added resources for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a geostrategic objective, not a development objective. And so there is this new realization, and I think I'm just back from Japan and Taiwan, also Korea, but especially in Japan and Taiwan, they're really alarmed, just as people in the Baltic region are alarmed about Russia. And I think this underlines one of these priorities that we have of democratic unity. We're not going to deal with these problems alone. We're going to need to work with other countries, and we can't sort of look at India or Japan and say, deal with it on your own. There has to be coalitions here. So we're going to have to find ways of building alliances, and those alliances are not just going to be based on democratic values, but the idea of trying to preserve the liberal world order. It's even hard in this town to use those words today, but something that really has helped preserve the peace for 7 decades and is responsible for the most dramatic economic growth in the southern part of the world in human history, in terms of poverty, in terms of education, in terms of infant mortality. The need to preserve that and build that at this time, it's threatened, and we have to find ways of strengthening our alliances in order to move forward and deal with the problem.
Okay, Sean, which one of those, door number 1 or door number 2?
C.
Okay.
Yeah. No, because I think, I think they're important questions, but I also think just underpinning them is this question about, global resurgent authoritarianism that we keep coming back to. And I think the way I would address the broader issue is that, something I said before, I really believe deeply in these people-to-people connections that we build. We build direct people-to-people connections with labor movements around the world. Andrew and CIPE with chambers and business and all our partners here on the stage with political parties and civic activists. I think when we're looking at the future, what we're seeing is a lot of breakdown of nation states, actually. We're seeing extraordinary disenfranchisement, people around the world, to Dan's point, fleeing war and conflict, and many people choosing to migrate for work because they have no economic opportunity at home. When I look at an environment like that, what I think about is what we need to be doing to be building a broader global human rights framework to address these permanent displacements of people. 150 million people working in third countries, 70 million permanently displaced people as refugees, often for 17 years. That's an enormous amount of time to go without, as a disenfranchised person in a country. Without rights, without freedom of association, without the right to vote, without the right to participate in the political process. I think when we think about the future and the future of democracy, we need to take into account these factors, and we need to start from now building a new kind of grassroots movement to defend human rights above and beyond the question of states and state sovereignty, and look at a higher dream of a true international human rights order in which all people, no one loses their human rights at a border, no one loses their human rights because they're made a refugee. And that's how I would respond to that in a more futuristic kind of way of looking at it.
Okay. Ken, so which one of those, if I said this Ned versus...
I'll take on the meddling.
Yeah, please.
Dan and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple months ago on this subject. You can look to create a metaphor here. You can look at a doctor that prescribes medicine for a patient designed to cure a disease, and a doctor that prescribes poison to kill a patient. And I think that that's the equivalent, the moral equivalency that the Russians try to create on the meddling issue. When the difference between what the Russians do is designed to subvert the democratic process, to undermine democratic discourse, and to try to influence the outcome of the election. What democracy assistance has done is to try to enhance the integrity of elections, elections that are usually fundamentally flawed. Let's not forget that Russia is a member of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is an institution designed around democratic principles broadly, and principles around democratic elections, which the Russians constantly violate. Engagement in Russia is to enhance participation, to support groups to protect the integrity of the process, and report on problems when and if they exist. It's quite different than what the Russians do to try to subvert the elections. So the motives are entirely different. And secondly, there's the issue of transparency. We all operate in the open. People in the country know who are being supported and the purpose for that support. And what the Russians do are, is in the shadows, darkness, and then they lie about it. And so it truly is apples and oranges. It truly is poison and life-saving medicine, and that's, I think, two fundamental differences. There have been instances in the past in terms of U.S. government intervention around elections. But the world has changed over the last 40 years, and the United States has changed over the past 40 years. And so it's also unfair to judge what was done 50, 60 years ago to the norms and standards that have been established over the last 30 years.
Amen. I agree with you. Thank you. Andrew.
I'll take China, but within a broader phenomenon we're looking at CIPE called corrosive capital. And I think what we need to appreciate is that in terms of, I think Chris Walker's at the Ned's thinking on sharp power, the use of investment as a political tool. Sometimes when there's a plan behind it, sometimes it's I think less organized. But trying to understand the way that capital flows from authoritarian states are distorting both the global economic order and local governance. And I think if we look for a solution to this, it's not going to be about containing China. Chinese money is a fact of life. It's going to be flowing. It's going to be either through the forms of private investment or state loans or state aid. Belt and Road is a big component of this. But the question is, when this money hits the local economy, how does it hit the local economy? What are the failures of governance at the local level that allows these funds to enter the country? And how do they corrode the rule of law institutions in a country, either through corruption or through other methods? I think if we take some of the early learning we're seeing on this, this is not, especially in terms of international finance, this is not World Bank finance. These are countries that are taking loans without following their own laws, without internal practice, that are being collateralized with the raw materials of their country or other assets of their country. And when they can't make the payment, it's not like the IMF shows up and bails them out.
They'll just take the port.
They take the port.
Right.
They take the bauxite.
It's a form of neocolonialism.
I call it the payday loan system of international finance. It's a cheap and easy loan to get, but God help you if you can't make the payments.
I was going to say the crack dealers of international finance, but something like that.
But what we're looking at here is how can improve public tendering at the local level. Maybe put some controls on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had 70 years. The procurement issue is a super boring topic and puts people to sleep. But 25 or 30% of the GNP passes through the hands of public procurement officials. And for 70 years, the international development community said, eat your low bid vegetables. So if you're a developing country and you buy a light bulb, buy the cheapest one. If you're going to buy a port, buy the cheapest one, because that's the simplest way to kind of reduce corruption, et cetera. What's happened, though, over time is there's been a realization that maybe cheap isn't really cheap, and sometimes you pay twice, but there's a series of other issues, and so there's been a move towards something called best value or life cycle cost. And so this is a super boring topic, but it has all sorts of geostrategic implications for the United States and the OECD.
At CIPE, we're good at working at the super boring stuff.
Oh, boy.
But I will say, too, that this is an issue for American business. because this is an issue where we don't get the tenders anymore. We don't get the export markets.
Right, what happens when we start?
And the other piece that's coming out here are private capital flows. Where, you know, if I'm taking money, if I'm a Chinese investor in an economy, and what we're learning about Chinese investment is that it doesn't raise standards, it doesn't raise all boats. It flows like water through cracks.
Yep.
It's going to find the weaknesses and it's going to go in there and it's going to reinforce them. So American companies can't compete. We're hearing this in places like Ukraine where they can't find the investment deals because the money from other countries is coming in that doesn't require people to follow international standards and allows corruption and other issues to happen. So
thank you.
Big point.
Okay, Dan, Russia versus the Ned and what they do, or China? Pick your poison.
I would like to do just a case study for 1 minute on the China corruption link and the role of our work more broadly in that. Malaysia, for 61 years, one party governed this country. Since it became independent in 1957, they constructed a totally gerrymandered, corrupt political system in which the ruling party accrued every advantage and doubled down on holding the tools of power fusion of state and kind of leading economic sectors, etc. So IRI, we had worked in Malaysia with opposition political parties since 2002. And guess whose funding we did it with? The National Endowment for Democracy. Because guess who wouldn't fund democratic political party work in Malaysia? The USAID Agency for International Development and the State Department, because they, you know, I think the reflection was, gosh, this is kind of a one-party system. This is a bad use of our funds, and two, Malaysia is kind of a valuable military partner. So for 15 years, working with NED resources, we worked to strengthen Malaysian opposition parties. And guess what happened 2 months ago? After 61 years, they won. Not thanks to us, thanks to them.
The good guys
There
won.
was such a reaction to the excesses of corruption and cronyism and nepotism. It had nothing to do with us. But it was the excesses of the one-party state, the kind of logical culmination of the abuses of power in this quite rich Southeast Asian country. And so I visited, and I was sitting there with many of the leaders, the new leaders of this government, many of whom were just our partners we had been working with for 15 years. And one of the most senior of them, who's now one of the people running the government, said to me, gosh, IRI, you never gave up on us even when we were ready to give up on ourselves, right? And we're sitting in the Prime Minister's office. Here we are. That's a tribute to them, not a tribute to us, but it's an example of playing the long game. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is the link, because guess what the first step, really one of the first steps the new government took? It froze Chinese infrastructure investments because it had opened the books and discovered that there was a lot of funny money swishing around what had been this very corrupt, closed, unaccountable system, right? And so there is a big corruption cleanup and there is a big kind of a deep dive on foreign influence in this country. This is not a hugely pro-American country. It's probably never going to be an actual US ally. But this is going to redound to our benefit, right? And that's an example of the long game.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open it up. You've been a patient audience. I'm going to make 2 rounds of Q&A, but I want to hear from Lana Baidas, who's a senior fellow here at the Human Rights Program at CSIS. I want to hear from former Congressman Vin Weber, who used to be the chair of the NED, and I want to hear from former Spanish ambassador to the United States, Javier Ruperez. So I'm going to start with Lana Baidas. Then I'll do another round.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for the esteemed panelists. I think you all shed the light on very important issue is how we can engage at the local level and how that needs to be really not parachuted. The whole idea of democracy should not be parachuted, but really internally grown at the local level. I think the most important, and this is based on our research done here at CSIS for the last 2 years, in terms of studying and understanding, examining the whole phenomena of closing civic space, how all stakeholders can work together at the local level. And this is important issue, and I like this whole holistic and robust engagement. Trade unions, definitely, they played a key role in terms of the Arab Spring, and without them, there was no mobilization. Businesses, civil society actors, social justice, a human rights organization, and a humanitarian, if that's work together, that's what we'll be able to consolidate.
Great. Okay. Please, over here, my friend, former Congressman Vin Weber, former chair of the NED. Over here.
Thank you, Dan. It's nice to see you. This is a great program you've had today. And I appreciate the optimistic focus, because there are good things happening around the world which we're all excited about. My concern about what we are all engaged in is not entirely outside of this country. It's a little bit more inside this country. There is a good news story there, because the Congress has remained very supportive of democracy promotion, and that's in no small measure due to the work of everybody that's on this panel today, as well as some of your predecessors. But I am concerned, as I look at polling about the American public's attitude toward the role of democracy promotion in U.S. foreign policy, that we're sort of standing on an eroding foundation. And eventually that would, I mean, maybe this is, traces back to erroneous perceptions of the Iraq War. Maybe it's lack of leadership at the White House level, both in this and the previous administration. I don't know, but what do you think, first of all, do you agree with that, that's a problem, and what do you think we all ought to be doing to rebuild support for democracy as a part of the American foreign policy at the grassroots level in our country? Okay,
great. So my friend, Ambassador Ruperez. So Ambassador Ruperez is a longstanding friend of mine, longstanding friend of the United States. You were present at the creation of Spanish democracy. You, I think, served in the first democratic government in Spain, and then you were involved with the OSCE before the OSCE was cool as well. So, Ambassador Ruperez, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dan. Well, thank you to you all. I mean, it's very moving to listen to you, because after all, the message you are transmitting is one of optimism, as far as democracy around the world is concerned. And just two remarks. One, I'm afraid in Europe right now that optimism is not very present, and there are a number of ambiguities and doubts, mainly on not only in Eastern Europe but even in Southern Europe. I mean, what is happening in Italy right now, what is happening in Hungary, what is happening in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and places like that is rather troubling in many ways. So I was wondering whether you have those experiences, whether you are working there as well and getting some sort of feedback in that respect. The second point was, if I may, when watching what is the attitude, the main attitude of the executive of this country, to put it mildly, it doesn't seem to be pretty much in line with your concerns about the spread of democracy around the world. When you watch the President of the United States getting along very well with the leader of North Korea, who doesn't seem to be a very democratic leader, or the leader of Russia, and at the same time to keeping a sort of very clear distance from democratic leaders in Europe, I wonder, I mean, are you going to be affected by that sort of disparity between what the White House thinks and what you are trying to do? Do you think that what you see in Congress, which is that sort of bipartisan approach, is going to be somehow rather affected by that lack of sympathy on the White House? How do you feel in that respect?
Ambassador, I was hoping we were going to ignore the elephant in the room. I mean, you're pointing at the elephant in the room, but so thank you for that. Yes, thanks, Ambassador. Thank you. Okay, so could be about the issue of closing civil society space. You could just pick one, and briefly, because I want to call on other folks you could hear from, or the issue of our foundations in the United States weakening for democracy promotion. Two of Ambassador Ruperez's points about, okay, this is great, but we may be, if this was a transatlantic project, what's your reaction to that, given there may be some weakening foundations, and if someone wants to, let's just, how does this link up with the Trump administration? Maybe be the fourth point. So you can't answer them all, but
part of the same question.
Sorry, the same question.
Okay, I'll be very brief, but I want to answer quickly all three. On the first question, You know, the NED, Lana, is it tries to provide a broad and full service support, because we have the 4 institutes represented here. And through our direct discretionary grants program, and we make 1,400 small grants a year to civil society organizations, to independent media, to groups, you know, working on the grassroots. So in a sense, you're covering the whole package, and it has to be bottom up. This work does not work from top down. It has to work from bottom up, and it would not be successful if there was not a demand at the grassroots for this kind of support, which there is. On the second question, Vin's question, Vin, I think the polling data shows that there is public support for this, and especially the polling data that comes out of the recent Freedom House Penn Biden Center, Bush Center study, which Elliot Abrams wrote up in his PowerPoint blog, and I'd go for that. But the numbers are overwhelming that there is public support for this work. I think we're in a different kind of a debate on policy, which then gets to Javier's point. And let me just say, and I want to just remember with Javier that it was in 1998 that together we worked together to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Spanish Constitution, and had a big celebration in the Congress over that, and it's part of the friendship between our two countries. You know, look, obviously there are problems, and I was being very indirect in my Huntington quote, and I could go on, but I won't. Let me just say that the problems we're having today, in my humble view, express the wisdom of the NED Act, which separated us from government. In other words, we do what we do regardless. Now, obviously, we're affected. That was the Huntington quote. We're affected by what happens in a broader way, and this is also going to change. But the fact is, we have been given by the Congress through the NED Act independence, an arm's length relationship to pursue this work consistently, and I think that's the reason why we've been successful, and I think that's the reason why we can survive the current period.
Okay, Shawna.
Yeah, quick response. I mean, certainly the Freedom House poll done bipartisan, Biden Center and Bush Center, worth reading. It shows very strong support of the American public for this work. But I wanted to just build quickly on something Lana said. So, you know, I started out by talking about movements, and you know, no democracy was ever made when a government just woke up and said, let's be a democracy today, or you know, no market was fair because money just rained down, and it rained down fairly. People coming together make democracies and make economies more fair. It's the movements of people joining together, using all our tools at our disposal, that advances democracy. And that's what you get when you're talking about the core institutes of the NED. We are connected at the grassroots. The Solidarity Center is connected to 700,000 workers all over the world every single year, who are building every single year in the face of tremendous pressure to advance human rights and democracy in their countries. And that's how change happens ultimately, from the ground, grassroots. And you know, I would say that part of that really needs to be in the future that all of us focus very seriously on massive corrosive disenfranchisement that is both economic and political. It's based on race and racism that is endemic in too many of our societies, anti-immigrant sentiment and vitriol towards refugees, the degradation of women, and women's rights need to be advanced. Collectively, we need to double down on ending the disenfranchisement of people in all its forms as part of our democracy work. This is not an elite business. This is movements coming together, people coming together that make democracies stronger and make economies more fair and work for everyone. And that's what really, I think, unites us, and also what inspires me.
Thank you. Okay, Ken?
Maybe I'll just respond to Javier a little bit. I think overseas, people look to the United States, and it's not only a view that they have of the president, that they view our institutions in this country. And there are places where we work, in some of the most difficult places in the world, in northern Syria, for example, where they would say, we aspire to have your problems. And they can compartmentalize. Secondly, we have staff representing 100 nationalities. We're not trying to propagate an American model of democracy. The largest program for NDI is in Jordan, that is run by a Kosovar who's been with NDI for 17 years and started as a driver and a translator for NDI. And he is an extraordinarily talented individual. And this is true in many other countries. And I think two other factors. Number one, the Founding Fathers had Article 1 of the Constitution delineate the powers of the Congress, not the powers of the executive branch. And in this arena, that is extremely important, particularly when it comes to the appropriation of funds. It's the administration that proposes and Congress that disposes. And the Congress, in a very, very bipartisan way, Carl mentioned this at the beginning in terms of a hearing that Dan, Carl, and I testified. It's an outpouring of bipartisan support.
32
for this
members
effort.
of Congress,
Yeah,
unbelievable.
32 stayed for 3 hours.
Unbelievable.
And Congress has always been at the forefront of this effort. It was Congress that created the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. It's the Congress that has always been the address for democratic activists around the world. It's been the Congress that has recognized their struggle. And that continues. And the administration is not monolithic either. There are a lot of people within the administration that still deeply believe in this.
And doing
push
great
it
things,
and doing
doing
very, very
important
good.
things.
So it's complicated. It is what it is. But when we survey our staff and our offices around the world and our partners, while it is complicated and certain leaders take a license as a result of certain remarks that are made, by and large it has not impacted that democratic architecture that I talked about earlier. There are certain challenges, but I don't think that they're insurmountable.
Andrew?
Two quick comments. One to Lana's question about how do we get people to work together. I think that's one of the, it's an aspiration, but I think it's one of the most difficult things we can do. A, we have to recognize that every country is going to have its own dynamics. But I can tell you, as someone who's been trying to get business and civil society to sit down at the same table for 20 years, it's very tricky to do because there is so much mistrust on either side. And how we get people to recognize common goals and common values is a first step in then getting them into the room together. The second on what can we do here, you know, my son took AP Government this year. And it was interesting to watch. We need to do a better job of teaching our kids. First of all, we have to realize that as we spread democracy abroad, so must we sow these seeds at home. And we really have to take it upon ourselves as our duty to do that. And I said, you know, he took the government course at the beginning of the year. He's now sitting down and watching Meet the Press. So I like to think that, you know, there is a payoff. We do create citizens. We have to be conscious about how we create citizens.
Good. Dan?
Just to put a point on the Freedom House, Bush Center, Penn Biden numbers, Congressman. 71% of Americans believe the US government should support, or that America should support, democracy in the world. 67% understand the link to national security. The question was phrased, does democracy out in the world make America a little bit safer? And 2 in 3 Americans fully said yes. And by a 2-to-1 margin, on the third question, that I remember the precise number on, the question was, should the US government increase or decrease support for democracy assistance? By a 2-to-1 margin, American taxpayers said increase, which is kind of an unusual figure given that nobody wants to spend more money on anything related to the government. So I do think we have something to work with, and of course we need a new generation of leaders, frankly, not just the Reagan alumni, but a new generation of leaders to make the case for why democracy in the world matters. What was the other point? Sorry, what was the other? Ambassador. Everywhere I go in the world, people actually don't want to talk about Donald Trump. Everywhere I travel for IRI, they want to talk about how we can use our toolkit to help them, right? Help them participate, help them mobilize, help them win elections, help them govern. My talking point is, look, no democracy is perfect. In America, we've been working on this for over 200 years, and we clearly still have some work to do. This is why we all believe in checks and balances, independent government institutions, judicial oversight, free media, vibrant civil society, right? We are not exporting an American model. We never were, but if we were trying to, it wouldn't work. We are bringing kind of an open government, open society toolkit to help countries at any stage of their government, at any stage of political development, succeed. And the work at the end of the day is actually about them. It's not about us.
Okay, 2 more questions. Okay, I want to hear from Alex Kravets, and I want to hear from this woman here in the sunglasses, okay? These 2.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for a great panel, and to Michael Levitt for providing the inspiration.
Yeah.
Quickly, because of the time, probably to NDI and IRI. You've talked about the importance of strengthening parties. I'm wondering, have you ever thought of creating, there's the ease of doing business, such standards that you could actually rate political
Quality
parties
of
where you
democracy
work?
or quality of political life?
Yeah. In other words, like almost like a charity navigator for political parties. Like, is this good? What are best practices and how do they stack up? And the second question, Iraq, it's sort of at portas, hopefully, of a better moment. We spent a lot of blood and treasure. You saw that, Dan. What are you doing? What's NDI and IRI doing there today?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, please.
Yes. Good afternoon. Tatiana Benavides, political scientist from Costa Rica. Thank you so much for all your input. I would like to ask if you have special initiatives in the United States, because you are a wonderful source of experiences and also best practices from around the world. And I think that you can add a lot to, to the democratic institutions in the United States. So I would like to know if you have any particular initiatives in the United States, for instance, elections monitoring or something like that. I've heard that you have something like that.
Okay, briefly, each one
Yeah,
of you.
no, on the second question, I've for a long time, and I even suggested this in my remarks, think that one thing that might be good here is to try to connect young people in this society and others to the activists that we support. And this has actually happened in a few universities already, but I think this has to be done in a much larger and systematic way. Because it just happens to be that in the established democracies, people have had it for a long time, they become a little bit jaded, take it for granted, don't realize how tough it is. And when they have contact with people from China, from Russia, from Syria, or elsewhere, people who are giving their lives for freedom, it's inspiring and it sort of reminds them, well, maybe we shouldn't take it for granted. And I think that's one thing that we can do. Second, just quick point is that we don't work in the United States, but I mentioned that we've created this International Coalition for Democratic Renewal, which is now spawning different working groups on transatlantic relations, on China, on Iran, on media, on social media, and so forth. And there is a working group that's in the process of being formed under the leadership of Freedom House on the United States, a kind of a U.S. coalition for democratic renewal, to bring people together, different initiatives that people are undertaking already to try to work a little bit more systematically and cooperatively about the United States.
Okay, Shauna.
I mentioned in the beginning we have a 100-year tradition in the American labor movement of seeking and supporting workers around the world in solidarity. That's 2 ways. We do exchange programs. We have an enormous amount of engagement. My staff from around the world come to the United States and meet with trade unionists in the US all the time, and we create programs that are transnational. Take an issue like endemic racism and racial discrimination across the Americas. It's not just the United States, it exists in Brazil. We bring people together to talk about how do we collectively come together across borders to challenge these kinds of issues that harm democracy and disenfranchise people. So that's part of our DNA we're really proud of.
Thank you. Okay. Ken.
Very, very quickly. NDI is part of this community of small d democratic political parties. We sit in the 3 largest international groupings of political parties, representing social democratic, Christian democratic, liberal, large L liberal ideologies, and represents 450 parties in 150 countries. And we have had a new initiative over the last couple years called 21st Century Parties, in which we don't rate parties, but we have a whole menu of modernization and reform initiatives that parties are taking, from cybersecurity to dealing with marginalized populations, women, youth, indigenous communities, and there's a whole movement now globally with parties trying to reflect and take specific issues, public integrity, corruption issues. And so now there is toolkits and menus and things that parties can do, and the question is how to create internal incentives and external incentives for reforms so the parties do take this initiative. On Iraq, we have never left Baghdad or Erbil since 2 months after the invasion. It's been sometimes very, very difficult. We've lost 9 people in Iraq over the years. But there are things happening, put aside the results of the last election. There are things that have changed and are happening, and I don't want to sound Pollyannish or naive, but if you look at the way the parliament in Iraq debates public policy issues and takes action on public policy issues, it's probably one of the more remarkable institutions in the region in terms of these issues. If you look at the way some parties like SCIRI and others have reformed, multi-sectarian parties that have developed, there are things that you can look at that are some positive trends, and particularly if you look at it in comparison to the rest of the region. So there are partners, civil society, parties, parliaments that you can work with, and reform and modernization efforts are taking place on the ground. So.
Okay. Andrew?
Just very briefly, I think American firms, as I mentioned at the outset, are now understanding and supporting the move for better governance and democracy abroad, because they see it as a way to level the playing field for them in emerging markets, that they can benefit from that. And I think that's a trend that's only continuing. And we're also seeing firms start to step up and find ways to work in partnership with governments in emerging markets to share their experience in terms of information flows, data protections, and other things. These are the next generation of business issues and governance issues that we're facing.
Iraq, where NDI and IRI both operate, we have a division of labor. So while NDI works with the parliament, we are working with provincial legislatures and working on women's empowerment. And I would say more broadly in the Arab world, empowering women is essential. It creates humane politics across the board, right? In societies that are just dominated by male elites. With provincial assemblies and often lower local level governance, we find in the Arab world in particular, we get a lot more traction there, because that's where the connection between citizens and governance is closest, and that's where politicians can actually deliver. It's hard to deliver if you're a national politician. If you need a new garbage disposal collection or a new set of streetlights, that's actually easier for a politician. So if you're thinking about building a democratic state, can I just, in 10 seconds, I never answered Dan's question about what I'm optimistic about. I'm really optimistic about Africa. I just got off the plane this morning. In the next 30 years, 1 billion Africans will be born. By 2050, there will be 2.5 billion citizens of Africa. Half of them will be under 25 years old. Now, if we don't get governance right across this vast region, conflict, extremism, and migration will accrue. But when we think about the future of democracy, I would argue that this is almost where it matters most.
That's where the action's
in
gonna
this
be at.
region where all the action will be, and where young people are not going to stand up for the old strongman style of politics.
Amen. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ken. More to come. Thank you. Thanks, Shauna. Thank you.